The Martian dawn broke like a broken promise, the kind the universe seemed too fond of making these days. The sky was a crusty orange, like a planet-sized hangover that just wouldn't go away. It painted the Martian colony in a shade that said, "Hey, we're screwed, but at least it's a nice color, Doctor." Selene Arcturus was doing what she did best, avoiding work by pretending to work. Her lab was a chaotic mess of tubes, monitors, and the smell of something that might have been coffee in a previous life. She poked at her console, hoping it wouldn't poke back. The screen flickered like it was considering its options. "Another day in paradise," Selene muttered, squinting at a particularly uncooperative test result. The joy of biochemistry, making the impossible possible, one failed experiment at a time. The door to her lab slid open with a hiss more fitting for a villain's lair than a research station. In walked Captain Jax Riven, the colony leader, looking somewhat like a human version of a bad-tempered bear. His uniform was as crisp as the situation was dire. "Selene," Jax said, in that voice that managed to be both commanding and exhausted at the same time. "We've got a situation." Selene raised an eyebrow. "We're on Mars in a quarantine zone with aliens. Which particular flavor of situation are we talking about today?" Jax's face was a study in grim determination, the kind that usually accompanied words like "we're all going to die in the movies." "Our food supplies are being sabotaged." "By whom?" Selene asked, though she had a sneaking suspicion she already knew the answer. "Zalter," Jax replied, like he was spitting out a particularly sour lemon. "They've been tampering with our hydroponics." "Alien bastards," Selene said, not without a hint of admiration. "Gotta give them credit for creativity." Jax leaned against the nearest counter, managing to knock over a beaker with an unceremonious clatter. "We need solutions, Selene, fast." Selene sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Sure, let me just whip up an anti-alien sabotage formula. I've got it right next to my jar of miracle cures." Outside, the Martian wind howled like it was auditioning for a horror movie. It rattled the thin walls of the colony, reminding everyone inside just how precarious their situation was. Mars was home now, warts and all, and like any good home, it seemed intent on killing them. Selene turned back to her console, punching buttons with more determination than accuracy. "All right, I'll see what I can do, but no promises. If the Zalter are as smart as they seem, this could get ugly." "We're already ugly, Selene. Now let's see if we can get dangerous," Jax replied, a ghost of a smile playing across his lips. The situation in the colony had been deteriorating faster than a politician's approval rating. The Zalter, with their smug superiority and disturbingly efficient sabotage techniques, were pushing the limits of what human stubbornness could handle. Resources were dwindling, morale was tanking, and the only thing growing was a collective sense of impending doom. Selene and Jax walked through the corridors of the colony, their footsteps echoing in the sterile halls. The place smelled like recycled air and desperation, with a hint of optimism someone had accidentally left out overnight. "You ever think we should have stayed on Earth?" Jax asked, as they passed a group of engineers unsuccessfully arguing with a broken door. Selene chuckled, "And miss all this?" Never. They reached the colony's control room, a hub of activity with as much energy as a corpse on a good day. Screens displayed various sectors of the colony, each one bleaker than the last. The Zalter had a knack for making human technology look like it had been designed by an overconfident toddler. "We're losing output from Sector 7, said an operator, his tone suggesting he'd rather be anywhere else, maybe even on fire. "That's where the hydroponics are," Jax said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Damn it, I knew it. I'm starting to think they actually want us to starve," Selene said, her voice laced with sarcasm sharper than a vibro blade. "Starving's just bad PR." "They want us to give up," Jax replied, his eyes scanning the monitors as if they might suddenly show something hopeful. They didn't. Selene tapped a few buttons on the main console, the screen lighting up with data that might as well have been written in ancient Martian for all the sense it made. "We need to find the source of the sabotage. See if we can cut it off at the knees before we're all gnawing on each other's limbs for sustenance." Jax nodded. "Any ideas? Burn the whole place down and hope we have enough oxygen to celebrate afterwards. I'll keep that as Plan Z," Jax said with a dry smile. The day dragged on, like a prisoner being hauled to the gallows. Selene worked through the night, her lab more of a war zone than a place of science. She was surrounded by notes, hypotheses, and the kind of caffeine-fueled determination that had built empires and destroyed civilizations. "You know," she said to no one in particular, "I always thought I'd end up saving the world, or at least winning a Nobel Prize. Not playing cat and mouse with aliens on a dustball." She glanced at a Petri dish under the microscope, squinting as if sheer willpower could bend it to her understanding. "Come on, give me something," she whispered, as if sweet-talking a lover. The door slid open again and Jax walked in looking more rumpled than ever. "Any progress? Depends on if you count mad scientist breakdown as progress," Selene replied. "Right now I'll take what I can get." Jax said, grabbing a stool and sitting next to her. They sat in silence, surrounded by the hum of machines and the occasional groan of the colony as it settled into the night. The Zaltar were out there, watching, waiting, and probably laughing at the humans scrambling to survive. You know, Celine said, breaking the silence, for once I'd like to meet an alien species that isn't trying to kill us. Maybe one that just wants to swap recipes or something. Jax chuckled. Yeah, How to Cook Humans would be a bestseller. Celine snorted, a sound halfway between a laugh and a groan. All right, back to work. If the Zaltar want a fight, we'll give them one. The night stretched on, but for the first time in days, hope was a flickering candle instead of a blown-out match. As the first light of Martian day seeped through the thin atmosphere, Celine's console beeped with a sudden alert. What the hell is that? Jax asked, leaning closer. Celine's eyes widened as she scanned the data. I think it's a communication. From the Zaltar, Jax's face went from tired to wary faster than a speedster on a caffeine binge. Think they're finally going to tell us what they want. Celine leaned back in her chair, a smile forming on her lips. Only one way to find out. With that, Celine tapped the console, opening the message. What flashed across the screen was a mix of symbols and gibberish that made her head spin. But the last line was clear, a message in rough, broken English that chilled her to the bone. We come. Jax straightened, his eyes meeting hers. Looks like they're tired of playing games. Celine nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. Good, so am I. In the harsh light of Mars, with the Zaltar breathing down their necks, the two of them prepared to fight back with every ounce of human stubbornness they could muster. Because if there was one thing humans were good at, it was ruining someone's day, even if that someone had tentacles. As they readied themselves for the inevitable confrontation, one thing was certain. Mars was about to get a lot more interesting. There's something about staring down an alien message that makes you feel like you've pissed off the wrong interstellar deity. Celine and Jax, with the weight of the colony on their shoulders, found themselves doing just that. The words "we come" might have been succinct, but it was the kind of succinct that made you want to check your life insurance. Well, this is going to make for one hell of a group therapy session, Celine said, leaning back from the console with a sigh. Think they'll bring crumpets. Crumpets would be nice, Jax replied, rubbing his temples. But I'm guessing they're more into the whole starve you into surrender sh stick. Yeah, because nothing says welcome wagon like forced malnutrition, Celine quipped, her fingers drumming a rapid beat on the console. What's the strategy, fearless leader? Strategy, Jax chuckled without humor. I'm fresh out of strategies. I was hoping you had a miracle in your back pocket. Celine shrugged, her mouth twisting into a smirk. All I've got are some dusty lab notes and a half-empty bottle of whiskey. Pick your poison. The whiskey sounds tempting, Jax admitted, but I think the colony could use a bit of a pep talk. Maybe rally them before they start trading limbs for snacks. Motivational speaking. My favorite part of the apocalypse, Celine said, standing up with a groan. Guess we should break the news before everyone figures out the Zaltar are more interested in farm-to-table dining, with us as the main course. They made their way to the colony's main hub, a place brimming with the kind of energy you'd find at a funeral after-party. The colonists were gathered, faces etched with worry and the kind of fatigue that no amount of caffeine could fix. The air was thick with recycled hope and nervous tension. Jack stepped up to a makeshift podium, which was really just a box with a fragile sticker peeling off the side. All right, listen up, he barked, commanding attention with the finesse of a drill sergeant and the warmth of an Arctic expedition. I'm going to level with you, Jax began, his voice steady. Our food supplies are being sabotaged by the Zaltar. Apparently they've decided that starving us into submission is the new galactic pastime. A murmur rippled through the crowd, a mix of concern and the kind of resignation only seasoned Martian colonists could muster. Celine stood beside him, arms crossed, looking like she'd rather be anywhere else than giving pep talks to desperate humans. But, Jax continued, we're not going to roll over and let them win. Not now, not ever. Because if there's one thing humanity's good at, it's being stubborn bastards when it counts. That got a smattering of applause, more polite than enthusiastic, but it was something. We've been through worse, Celine chipped in, because why not add a dash of sarcasm to the mix? Remember last year's oxygen leak, or when Frank tried to make moonshine and blew up his lab? That was a fun week. A few chuckles erupted, the kind that came from shared misery and the bond of having survived yet another round of calamities. We're going to fight back, Jax said, his voice firm. We'll find a way to grow food, even if we have to choke it out of this damn planet with our bare hands. Which, incidentally, might be the next step, Celine added. We're going to start experimenting with Martian flora. Turns out there might be some potential there, assuming we don't end up poisoning ourselves in the process. Risk we'll have to take, Jax said. So, let's get to it. We're not going down without a fight. The crowd dispersed slowly, a mix of grim determination and weary acceptance. They weren't marching off to war, but they weren't giving up either. That counted for something. As the last of the colonists shuffled away, Jax turned to Celine. Think they bought it, Celine snorted. They're out of options, Jax. More like rented it with a no-return policy. Fair point, he conceded. Now, about that Martian flora. Celine's lab had seen better days, though it had never really seen good days to begin with. The chaos was comforting in its own way, like an old friend that just wouldn't leave. She had spread out samples of Martian plants, each one looking more unappetizing than the last. Meet our potential new diet, Celine said, gesturing to the table. Martian moss, Martian fungi, and whatever this is, looks like someone vomited up a cactus. Jax picked up a sample with a grimace, holding it like it might bite him. We're going to eat this, if it doesn't eat us first, Celine replied. The trick is figuring out which parts are edible and which parts will make your insides implode. Sounds like a fun science project, Jax said dryly. Got any volunteers? Volunteers? Sure, Celine said, flashing a wicked grin. But I'm thinking of starting with rats, or maybe Frank. He's always been a bit of a lab rat. Jax chuckled, setting the sample down. Let's hope they're not allergic to Martian fare. Celine got to work, her hands moving with practiced precision. She set up experiments, each one a little more desperate than the last. The lab filled with the scent of chemicals and the occasional puff of smoke, evidence of trial and error, mostly error. Think we'll make it out of this one? Jax asked, leaning against the doorway. Depends on how much you like the taste of Martian moss, Celine replied, not looking up from her microscope. Can't be worse than the rations, Jax said. The night stretched on, and the colony held its collective breath, waiting for a breakthrough or a breakdown. Celine worked through the hours, her mind focused on the task at hand, ignoring the gnawing hunger and the fatigue pressing down on her. A message from the Zalter came in during the early hours, a curt reminder that negotiations were not on the table, only submission. Jax read it with a mix of irritation and understanding. It was a war of attrition, a game of who would cave first. Charming folks, aren't they? Celine commented, reading the alien ultimatum. They've got a real flair for the ominous, Jax agreed. But we're not done yet, not by a long shot, Celine affirmed, her voice laced with determination. The experiments continued, and slowly, painfully, results began to trickle in. Some Martian plants were promising, others less so. It was like piecing together a puzzle where half the pieces wanted to kill you. Think we've got something, Celine said one morning, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. Jax perked up, eyes narrowing. Edible? Potentially, Celine said, holding up a test tube. Assuming you're not allergic to Martian fungi. Guess we're about to find out, Jax said, a hint of a smile on his lips. Celine set about preparing a sample, the lab filled with the sterile scent of science and a touch of desperation. The fungi was cooked in a makeshift oven, the process more chemistry experiment than culinary endeavor. Bon appetit, Celine said, handing Jax a small piece. Jax eyed it warily like it might explode in his face. Bottoms up, he said, before popping it into his mouth. The room went silent as he chewed, his expression a mix of concentration and alarm. Celine watched, arms crossed, ready to call for a medic if necessary. Well, she asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Tastes like dirt, Jax said finally, swallowing with a grimace. But it's food, Celine echoed, letting out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. All right, Jax said, determination hardening his voice. Let's get to work scaling it up. Because if there's one thing we're not going to be, it's alien dinner. The colony slowly buzzed back to life, fueled by hope and Martian fungi, a combination that promised survival, if not gourmet satisfaction. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep going, to keep fighting. As the Martian days wore on, Celine and Jax continued their work, stubbornly clinging to each small victory, each step forward. The Zalter might have thought humans would break under pressure, but they hadn't counted on one simple truth. Humans were annoyingly persistent. And as Celine often said, if you can't kill him, you might as well outlast him. Celine's lab looked like ground zero for a biochemical apocalypse, which wasn't too far from the truth. Tubes and flasks were strewn across every available surface, and the walls apparently hadn't seen a cleaning cloth since before the first Martian sunrise. It was the perfect setting for someone to come in and mess up her latest experiments, which is exactly what happened. She stared at the mess that had once been her meticulously labeled vials of Martian flora extracts. Now they looked like a particularly untalented toddler's art project. Well, she muttered, I guess someone didn't appreciate my artistic vision. Jax entered, brows furrowed and the corners of his mouth turned down like he'd just bitten into a lemon. Looks like someone's been redecorating. Yes, some real avant-garde stuff, Celine replied, gesturing at the chaos with a sweep of her hand. Either someone's sabotaging us or Frank had another bright idea while sleepwalking. Jax considered this, crossing his arms in a way that said he was trying to think but mostly just procrastinating. I'll talk to Frank, he said. Make sure he didn't mistake your lab for the bathroom again. What about the other possibility? Celine asked, more serious now. Think we've got a mole, Jack sighed, a sound like air rushing out of a leaky tire. Colonists are on edge. Desperate people do desperate things. But yeah, it's possible. Fantastic, Celine said with mock enthusiasm. As if we didn't have enough problems. Now we get to play Guess Who, Traitor Edition. Could be worse, Jack said. How's that? We could still have Frank's moonshine to deal with. Celine chuckled despite herself. True, we barely survived that last year. Anyway, I'll start redoing the experiments. Between inhaling Martian spores and whatever's left of my patience, something's bound to work. Jax nodded, already halfway to the door. Just keep me posted, and watch your back. I've seen friendlier gazes from a Zaltar. Copy that, Celine said, turning back to her lab bench. If you need me, I'll be here, losing my mind one compound at a time. As Jax left, Celine stared at the mess before her. It was going to take every ounce of her dwindling patience to reconstruct her research. But if there was one thing she was good at, it was working under pressure and complaining about it while she did. Hours turned into days, and Celine worked tirelessly, fueled by caffeine and spite. The sabotage loomed over her like a shadow, whispering doubts into her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone in the colony wanted them to fail. The Zaltar's message was clear: surrender or suffer, and someone here might just be willing to take door number 1. Midway through yet another session of chemical chaos, Jack stormed in like a thundercloud in a hurry. We've got a problem, he said, which was becoming his unofficial greeting. Only one? Celine asked, not looking up from her microscope. Frank's missing. Okay, maybe 2 problems, she corrected, setting the microscope aside. Please tell me he didn't wander into the Zaltar's camp to negotiate peace with a bottle of that swill he calls the elixir. Not sure, Jax admitted, running a hand through his hair. But he left a note saying he had a solution to our food problem. And then, poof, gone, Celine snorted. A solution from Frank? I'd be more worried he's trying to brew us a nice Martian poison. Jax forced a smile. Either way, I need you to keep an eye out. If he comes back with anything that smells remotely like a solution, take cover. Roger that, she replied. I'll be ready with a hazmat suit and a fire extinguisher. As Jax turned to leave, a thought struck Celine. Jax, what if Frank's disappearance isn't a coincidence? Jax paused, considering this. You think he's the mole? Either that or he's the stupidest genius we've got, Celine said. Which, given our luck, is probably the case. I'll keep looking into it. Meanwhile, don't let anyone near your lab unless you've got a bodyguard. Great, she said, sarcasm dripping from her voice like acid. Because who doesn't love working under armed supervision? Jax gave her a tight-lipped grin. Good. I'll check back in later. He left her alone, surrounded by her messy fortress of chemicals and suspicion. As she went back to work, Celine couldn't help but wonder who in their right mind would sabotage their best shot at survival. Then again, surviving Mars wasn't exactly a sane person's gig to begin with. A few days later, Celine had rebuilt her experiments from scratch, layering on more security protocols than an interplanetary bank. She even got Jax to install a camera in the lab, something they joked would finally capture the elusive Martian lab gremlin in action. Just as she was about to run another test, Jax burst in, looking like he'd just seen a ghost. Or worse, Frank doing karaoke. Celine. We found him, Frank, she asked, her interest piqued. Or the mole, both, Jax said, his eyes alight with a mix of triumph and exhaustion. Turns out Frank was the mole, or at least he thought smuggling info to the Zaltar would earn him some brownie points. Celine set down her test tube carefully, as if it might explode from sheer disbelief. You've got to be kidding me. Wish I was, Jax said. He's under lock and key now, blubbering about how the Zaltar promised him all the moonshine he could drink. Well, I guess treason does funny things to a man's priorities, Celine quipped, feeling a strange sense of relief and betrayal all at once. So what's next? Next, we try not to implode, Jax said. And maybe figure out how to not kill each other before the Zaltar do. Sounds like a plan, Celine said, picking up her test tube again. Let me know how I can help. Just keep doing what you're doing, Jax replied. And hopefully it won't involve Frank's secret recipe. With Frank out of the picture, the colony was left to pick up the pieces of its shattered sense of trust. Celine, for her part, was determined to finish what she'd started without looking over her shoulder every 5 seconds. It wasn't long before her efforts paid off. One of the Martian fungi strains showed real promise, not just as something that wouldn't kill them, but something that could keep them sustained for the long haul. The irony wasn't lost on her that their salvation might be as simple as a fungus growing in Martian dirt, a fitting metaphor for their scrappy, resilient crew. She shared the breakthrough with Jax in his cramped office, which was as much a sanctuary as it was a prison. He listened intently, nodding as she laid out her findings. So we can eat it, he asked, hopeful yet cautious. Pretty much, Celine confirmed. And it's not half bad if you close your eyes and pretend it's something fancier. He chuckled, a rare sound these days. Who knew fungi would save the day? Maybe we should get it a medal, or a Nobel Prize, Celine suggested with a smirk. They shared a moment of much-needed levity, the kind that was as fleeting as a shooting star in the Martian sky, but it was enough to remind them that they weren't beaten yet. Jax, Celine said, more serious now, we've still got a long way to go. The Zaltar aren't just going to pack up and leave because we found a new food source. Jax nodded, his expression hardening into one of determination. I know, but it's a start, and sometimes that's all we need. True, she agreed. So, let's get to it. Because if the Zaltar want to fight, they're going to get one hell of a stubborn resistance. Here's to being annoyingly persistent, Jax toasted with an imaginary glass. Celine raised her invisible glass in return, and to outlasting the bastards. With that, they set about the task of rebuilding the colony's faith in itself, one stubborn, fungus-fueled step at a time. They knew it wouldn't be easy. But if there was one thing humanity excelled at, it was surviving the impossible, preferably with a sarcastic comment or two along the way. As the Martian sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over their gritty little settlement, Celine and Jax prepared for whatever came next. They couldn't predict the future, but they could face it head-on, armed with science, determination, and just enough gallows humor to make it through another day. And if the Zaltar wanted to see what humanity was really made of, they were about to get a masterclass in human tenacity. Because the one thing Celine and Jax knew better than anything was this: outlasting the odds, no matter how long it took, was what they did best. After all, when life gives you Martian fungi, you make a feast, or at least a halfway decent meal. Celine Arcturus was elbow-deep in Martian fungi when the message came through. It was one of those rare moments where she actually looked like she was working, a fact that had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the colony. Her lab was still a chaotic mess, an explosion of papers, test tubes, and absolutely no indication that anyone responsible worked there. The lab bench was a haphazard battlefield of scientific paraphernalia, but Celine wore it like armor, as if daring the universe to take a shot. The console beeped, that annoying chirp that signaled Jax was about to barge in with bad news. Again. It was practically tradition at this point. Celine, Jax's voice crackled through the intercom, sounding very much like he was gnawing on gravel. We need to talk. Can't it wait until I've figured out how not to poison us with fungus soup? Celine replied, only half joking. The last batch had turned a color she could only describe as Martian regret. Not really. We've got another issue, Jax said, his voice underlined with that familiar frustration that came from leading a group of stubborn lunatics on a planet that constantly tried to kill them. Of course we do, she muttered, leaving her half-mutant fungi and striding over to the console. All right, hit me with it. We've got evidence of a mole, Jax said, cutting straight to the chase like a man slicing through a particularly tough piece of Martian beef jerky. Celine pinched the bridge of her nose. You mean besides Frank? Please tell me it's not another aspiring Benedict Arnold with a drinking problem. Afraid not, Jax replied. This one's a little more subtle. We found a transmission log, one with coordinates pointing straight at the Zaltar's camp. A thoughtful silence settled over the lab, broken only by the hum of failing ventilation systems. Fantastic, Celine sighed. So not only do we have aliens out there, but we've got someone in here giving them a big thumbs up and a map. Seems like it, Jax agreed. I need you to keep doing what you're doing, though. We're gonna need more than fungus to win this. Oh, don't worry, Celine said, glancing at the fungal growth with all the affection one would afford a persistent rash. I've got a little pet project in mind. Pet project? Jax asked, curiosity piqued. Infusing human emotions into the food supply. Make it taste like despair or something equally unappetizing. You know, give the Zaltar a taste of what it's like being us. Problem is, I'm short on resources and sanity. There was a pause, and Celine could almost hear Jax processing this through his tired, overworked brain. Great, how do we help? Well, I could use some actual equipment that isn't made from spare parts and wishful thinking, Celine said, and maybe a few volunteers. You know, in case I accidentally turn someone into a zombie. Typical day then, Jax replied. Exactly, she said, smiling despite herself. I'll send you a list of what I need. Good, keep your head down, Celine, and watch out for any other would-be traitors, she chuckled. At this rate, I'll need eyes in the back of my head. The intercom went silent, leaving Celine once more with her fungi and a growing sense of paranoia. Trust was becoming a rare commodity, rarer than functioning oxygen filters, anyway. As the days stretched into nights, Celine buried herself in her work, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling that someone was always watching. She had turned her lab into something that resembled a cross between a chemist's workbench and a junkyard. Equipment cobbled together from scraps lay strewn across every available surface, and the whole place smelled vaguely of burnt toast and desperation. One evening, Jax dropped by unannounced, his expression as stormy as the Martian dust outside. Celine. Bad news? Is it ever good news? She asked, not bothering to look up from the petri dish she was threatening into submission with her gaze. Not when it's about us, Jax said, dragging a hand down his face. The Zaltar are moving closer. Looks like they're gearing up for something. Great, Celine muttered, as if we didn't have enough to worry about. Let me guess they're looking for a taste tester for my new recipe. Jax gave a humorless chuckle. Might be, but we've got bigger problems. Some of our people are starting to panic. I'm worried they might do something stupid. And by stupid, you mean sabotage-why, mole-why, or just plain old-fashioned dumb. All of the above, Jax said grimly. We can't afford any more slip-ups. Celine nodded, finally setting her work aside. All right, I'll see what I can do on my end, but we need to flush out the mole before they do any more damage. Agreed. We've got eyes on a few suspects. Keep your ears open. Will do, Celine promised. And Jax, we're going to need a hell of a distraction. Jax gave her a wry smile. Any ideas? Well, if there's one thing we humans excel at, it's throwing a party in the middle of a disaster. True, Jax said, his eyes lighting up with that dangerous glint of inspiration. If we can keep morale up, maybe we can buy some time. Exactly, Celine said. Let's give them a show. And while they're distracted, I'll work on getting that emotional infusion ready. Sounds like a plan, Jax said, already turning toward the door. Just don't blow up the lab in the process. Only if you promise not to let the colony implode, she shot back. With that, Jax left, and Celine returned to her fungal Frankenstein. She was determined to see this through, even if it meant working around the clock and requiring more coffee than was strictly advisable. Days turned into a blur of caffeine-fueled research and paranoid glances over her shoulder. The console beeped occasionally with updates from Jax, each message a reminder that the Zaltar were closing in. Celine forged ahead, her mind a whir of formulas, equations, and the occasional dark thought of what she'd like to do to the mole if she ever caught them. She was halfway through a particularly tricky mixture when Frank's whiny, unmistakable drawl echoed through the colony's main hub. Everyone in earshot groaned collectively, the sound of it like nails on a chalkboard. Celine poked her head out of the lab, intrigued despite herself. Frank, it seemed, had been released from whatever makeshift cell Jax had stashed him in, and was now loudly proclaiming his innocence to anyone who'd listen. I swear I didn't mean to. Sure, Frank, one of the engineers called back. And I'm the Queen of Mars. I'm serious, Frank insisted, a wild look in his eyes that suggested either desperation or the aftereffects of tasting his own moonshine. I was trying to help. Celine exchanged a glance with Jax, who had appeared at her side like a silent, sleep-deprived ghost. What's he doing out? She asked, keeping her voice low. Thinks he can help us with the Zaltar, Jax replied, watching the scene unfold with an expression that could curdle milk. You didn't actually let him out, did you? No, but I figured it might help morale to give him a chance to make a fool of himself, Celine snorted, and provide a distraction. Exactly, Jax said, his lips twitching toward a smile. Though I'd kill for coffee right about now. Join the club, she replied, shaking her head at Frank's antics. He's going to get himself shot if he keeps this up. Maybe, Jax agreed, but if it keeps the colonists from turning on each other, I'll take it. Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the edge of the crowd. A group of engineers was huddled around something, their voices raised in alarm. What's going on? Celine asked, already moving toward the noise. Jax followed her, his expression shifting from wary amusement to concern. Let's find out. They pushed through the throng of bodies, eventually coming to a halt in front of the makeshift entertainment. In the middle of the group stood a young technician, holding a small device that hummed ominously. Found this near the comms tower, the technician said, his voice tight with nerves. It doesn't belong to us. Celine felt a chill dance down her spine. Is it from the Zaltar? Looks like it, he replied, handing it over to Jax. Jax examined the device, his eyes narrowing. Could be a transmitter or a bomb. Well, isn't that just the cherry on top? Celine muttered. We've got ourselves a full-blown mystery here. Jax nodded, his expression grim. And we're going to solve it before someone else decides to help the Zaltar out. He handed the device back to the technician, who handled it like it might explode any second. Get it to the lab. We'll need to run some tests. The kid nodded and scurried off, leaving Celine and Jax in the growing tension of the colony's main hub. Looks like we've got our work cut out for us, Celine said, her voice carrying a hint of the grim determination she needed to keep slogging through the muck. Jax nodded. I'll handle the crowd. You get back to your lab and see what you can find out. On it, Celine said, already moving. And Jax, yeah, let's try not to blow anything up before dinner. He gave her a wry grin. Deal. Just keep us posted. As she headed back to her lab, the weight of the situation settled heavily on her shoulders. The colony was teetering on the edge, caught between the threat of the Zaltar and the traitor within, and it was up to Celine and Jax to keep it from toppling over. Celine resumed her work with renewed vigor, her mind racing to unravel the mysteries of the alien device and her own experimental infusion. There was no room for error and no time to waste. The fate of the colony and perhaps humanity itself hung in the balance, and if Selene had anything to say about it, they wouldn't go down without a fight, even if it meant fighting with a sarcastic quip and a fungus-infused biscuit in hand. The Martian sky, that crusty orange blanket of despair, settled over the colony like a particularly persistent headache. Selene Arcturus stared at it through the narrow window of her lab, thinking how fitting it was that even the sky seemed to be mocking them. Her lab was a mess, the kind of mess that would make a hoarder weep with pride. Equipment cobbled together from what might have once been useful parts was strewn about, and the fungal concoction she'd been working on bubbled ominously in a corner. Doctor. Arcturus, Jax's voice crackled over the intercom, sounding like someone had put a bear through a meat grinder. We've got a situation. When don't we? Selene replied, not bothering to disguise the sarcasm in her voice. She flicked the intercom switch with a sigh. What's it this time? Did Frank finally manage to set himself on fire? Not yet, but give him time, Jax replied dryly. We've got a bigger problem. The Zalter have moved closer. Looks like they're planning something. Could use your expertise on this. Selene rolled her eyes, a gesture that had become almost reflexive. Oh, fantastic. Just what I needed today. A little alien intrigue to spice up my life. She knew it was serious. Jax wasn't one to pull the emergency cord unless it was absolutely necessary. The colony was teetering on the brink of collapse, and every day brought new challenges. Resources were dwindling, and the Zalter were getting bolder. If they were planning an attack, the colony would need every able-bodied person to fend them off, or at least delay the inevitable. Be right there, she said, grabbing her coat and heading out into the hub where Jax was waiting, looking like someone who hadn't slept in a week, and if the rumors were true, he probably hadn't. We need to talk, he said, his voice barely above a growl. Talk or argue, she asked, quirking an eyebrow. Because I'm not sure I have the energy for both. You're all heart, Selene, Jax muttered. Look, the Zalter have been moving in on our perimeter. We've already lost a few supply depots. We tried to raid one of theirs, but it went sideways. Sideways like they shot back? Selene asked, folding her arms. Dead, Jax said bluntly. We lost some good people. The words hung in the air like the stench of burnt coffee. Crap. If the colony was close to the edge before, this pushed them one strong gust away from toppling over entirely. What's the plan then? Selene asked. Besides standing around looking grim and brooding, Jax scrubbed a hand over his face, looking as though he'd aged a decade overnight. We need to get the colonists on the same page. They're on edge, ready to panic. We can't afford that. We've got to rally them, make them see we're still in this fight. Rally them, Selene echoed, a hint of incredulity in her voice. You do realize they're not exactly the cheerleader type, right? He snorted. We don't need pom-poms, just enough of a distraction to keep morale from bottoming out. You got that emotional infusion project going. Working on it, she replied. But I might need to up the dosage of despair. Seems we're running low on that too. Speaking of despair, Jax said. Any luck on finding our mole? Selene shook her head. Nothing definitive, but I've got eyes peeled and ears open. I'll nail the bastard when I find them. Just don't get yourself killed in the process, Jax warned, a hint of genuine concern in his voice. Who, me? Selene said, flashing a wry grin. I'm too stubborn to die. Together they walked back into the main hub, a space buzzing with activity and the kind of tension that comes from living on borrowed time. It was a mixed bag of colonists, engineers fiddling with machinery that never seemed to work quite right, and Frank, who somehow always managed to be both everywhere and nowhere at once. All right, listen up, Jax's voice boomed over the clamor, immediately grabbing everyone's attention. We've got a situation with the Zalter, and we need everyone to stay calm and stick together. Stick together, someone called from the back. Last time we stuck together, we ended up short a few people. Selene stepped forward. Look, I get it. This situation, she gestured vaguely, indicating the general crappiness of everything. It's not ideal, but panicking won't help. We need to stay focused and keep our wits about us. Frank, bless his idiotic soul, raised his hand. So what's the plan, huh? Hope they get bored and leave. Something like that, Jax replied, his tone dry as the Martian dust. But with more shooting and less dying on our end. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd like the first rain on a dry planet. Selene seized the moment. We've got some tricks up our sleeve, she said, including a little culinary experiment that might just make them think twice about snacking on us. There were curious glances exchanged, but the tension didn't abate. It was clear everyone was scared, and fear could make people do incredibly stupid things. Desperate people made desperate choices, and right now desperation was in abundance. All right, let's get back to work, Jax said, clapping his hands together. Stay vigilant, we're not out of this yet. The crowd began to disperse, albeit reluctantly, the worried murmur of voices gradually fading into the background noise of the hub. Selene turned to Jax. Think they bought it, she asked. Doesn't matter, Jax said. As long as they're not thinking about running for the hills, I'll take it. Even if the hills are just big piles of dust. Even then, Jax said with a tired smile. Celine nodded, turning back toward her lab. I'll keep working on the fungus. Maybe I can weaponize it after all. Just don't poison us in the process, Jax called after her. No promises, she replied, giving him a mock salute before disappearing into the controlled chaos of her lab. The following days were a blur of frantic activity. Celine burned through her limited supply of caffeine like it was the last hope of mankind, all while trying to balance the art of fungus cultivation with the intricacies of biochemistry. It was a delicate dance, one that promised either salvation or disaster in equal measure. She was hunched over a microscope, eyeing a particularly stubborn strain of Martian flora, when a sudden bang echoed through the lab, followed by a string of colorful curses that would make a sailor blush. It could only mean one thing. Frank, what did you break this time? Celine asked, not even looking up. Nothing, Frank protested, poking his head around the door. Just dropped a beaker, right? Celine said, her voice laced with doubt. Because you've never done that before. He shuffled into the lab, an awkward smile plastered on his face. Hey, listen, I wanted to, help out with the whole, whatever this is, Celine sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. Unless you've suddenly become an expert in biochemistry, I'm not sure how you can help, Frank. I can learn, he insisted, puffing up his chest in a way that was more comical than impressive. I've got time, not like we're going anywhere. Fine, Celine relented, figuring that any distraction might prevent him from accidentally setting something on fire. But don't touch anything without asking. Frank nodded, looking pleased as a kid who'd just been given the keys to the candy store. Celine watched him bumble around, making a mental note to keep anything flammable well out of his reach. It was a small moment of levity in an otherwise bleak landscape, but sometimes, even small victories could make all the difference. The days dragged on, filled with the monotony of survival and the ever-present threat of the Zalter looming over them like a storm on the horizon. Celine poured herself into her work, determined to find a solution, even if it was a long shot. And then came the day when the console beeped ominously, displaying a message that made Celine's blood run cold. A transmission from the Zalter, their language a garbled mess that the console struggled to translate. We come. It was a reminder that their time was running out, and any hope of salvation lay in their ability to work together. As Celine stared at the message, the weight of the colony's survival pressed down on her shoulders, heavier than the Martian sky itself. But if there was one thing humans were good at, it was surviving against all odds. And Celine was determined to ensure that they wouldn't go down without a fight, even if it meant trusting a bunch of terrified colonists and a well-meaning but hapless Frank to help her do it. After all, when faced with the unknown, sometimes all you could do was hang on to hope and a big enough gun. The Martian colony looked like a giant rusted toaster left on too long. And the mood inside wasn't much brighter, more of a slow roast to despair. With the Zalter creeping up on their doorstep, Celine and Jax knew they needed a plan that was crazier than Frank on a caffeine binge, or risk their own kind of toast. Here's the deal, Celine began, addressing a small group in the bowels of the colony's mess hall, which had the delightful scent of rehydrated disappointment. We make the Zalter regret ever sniffing around our turf. Regret it how? Asked Liam, a mechanic who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts under a deadline. We make him laugh, Celine said, her grin as wicked as a snake oil salesman on bonus day. Ah, comedy, Jax chimed in, arms crossed over his bear-like chest. The perfect weapon. Because when has humor ever failed to stop a rampaging alien? His sarcasm was thick enough to slice. Celine rolled her eyes. Think about it. We tweak the Zalter's food supply so it releases feel-good chemicals. We turn them into blissed-out, giggling blobs. They won't know what hit him. Or they just get the munches and decide we're the main course, Frank pointed out, managing to avoid breaking anything for once. Well, it's that or we start writing eulogies, Celine replied sharply. Anyone got a better idea? Silence. The kind that only comes when everyone's too scared to admit they don't have a clue. Great, so we're all agreed. Celine clapped her hands. We'll sneak into their base, work some biochem magic, and get out before they realize their 3 squares have turned into a cosmic joke. Do we even know how to get in? Liam asked, sounding like he'd rather face an engine failure than this mess. Frank's been doing some exploring, Jax said, glancing at the man who always managed to look both guilty and clueless. Right, Frank? Sure, if by exploring you mean tripping over air ducts, Frank said with a sheepish grin, but I know a way in, mostly. Mostly, Celine raised an eyebrow, because mostly doesn't sound all that reassuring. Hey, nothing's guaranteed except death and taxes, Frank said with a shrug, and Martian taxes really suck. All right, Jax interrupted, his voice a growling authority. Let's focus. We need a crew small, fast, and hopefully not prone to panicking, or sleepwalking, Celine added, shooting Frank a look that could melt steel. I can handle it, Frank insisted, though nobody seemed convinced. Just give me a chance. Fine, Frank, you're in, Celine conceded, because if things went south, at least they'd have someone to blame. Liam, you too. We might need someone to fix whatever you break. Liam looked less than thrilled but nodded. As long as it doesn't involve fixing Frank's brain. Good, Jack said, eyes scanning the ragtag bunch that was their best hope or their last stand. We move at dawn, Celine sighed, running a hand through her hair. It wasn't a perfect plan. Hell, it was barely a plan at all. But desperate times called for desperate measures and the occasional rash decision. Plus, nothing motivated like the imminent threat of being eaten. As they dispersed, prepping for the madness ahead, Celine felt a strange sense of calm. Maybe it was the knowledge that they were all in this insanity together, or maybe she was just beyond caring. Either way, it was nice to have a purpose beyond just waiting for the end. The night passed in fits and starts, sleep slipping through Celine's fingers like sand through a sieve. The colony's rhythmic hum felt like a lullaby composed by drunk oscillators. She spent those hours alternating between reviewing their plan and convincing herself it wasn't the dumbest thing she'd ever agreed to. At dawn, they gathered, the sky outside a crusty orange. It was a color Celine was starting to hate with a burning passion. Jack stood at the head of the group, looking like he was ready to wrestle a bear or an alien. Okay, he announced, here's to not dying, or at least not dying for nothing. Cheers, Celine muttered, adjusting her pack and checking her gear. It was all jury-rigged tech and hope, exactly what you'd expect from a bunch of humans trying to survive on a planet that wasn't exactly rolling out the welcome mat. The entry point was in one of the far reaches of the colony, a half-collapsed tunnel that Frank had graciously not managed to lose himself in. It was tight, and as Celine squeezed through, she couldn't help but grumble. I knew I should have skipped dessert. Don't say that, Frank said, wedged in awkwardly behind her. Dessert's the only thing that makes this hellhole bearable. Right, Liam said from the rear, because Martian jello really hits the spot. The tunnel spat them out near the Zalter perimeter, where the air buzzed with tension and a low hum that set Celine's teeth on edge. Their objective, a food processing unit, was nestled behind a cluster of alien machinery that pulsed with an unsettling organic glow. Remember, in and out, no heroics, Jax instructed, as they crouched behind a rock, peering at the alien facility like it was a particularly ugly piece of modern art. Heroics, not my style, Frank said, clutching his gear like it was a lifeline. Let's move, Celine whispered, heart pounding in her chest like it was trying to escape. They darted from cover to cover, each dash a gamble against the Zalter's notoriously sharp senses. Frank, surprisingly, was the first to reach the processing unit, fiddling with the alien tech like a kid with a new toy. I've got this, he muttered, pulling wires and toggling switches with a confidence that bordered on miraculous. Celine joined him, her fingers deftly mixing compounds and adjusting the delivery system. You better, because if this goes south, we're all gonna have a very bad day. I thought we already were, Liam commented, keeping watch with his makeshift weapon, a glorified pipe wrench that looked like it had seen better days. Shut it, Jax hissed, scanning the area for any sign of Zalter patrols. The shadows seemed to stretch and shift, shapes moving in the periphery of vision. Just hurry up, they worked in tense silence, the only sound the soft beeping of the console and the occasional muttered curse. Finally, Celine stepped back, wiping her brow. Done, let's hope the Zalter have a sense of humor, or a taste for Martian jello, Frank added with a nervous laugh. Time to go, Jax urged, already retreating toward their exit. The rest followed, adrenaline propelling them back through the tunnel, hearts thundering as they imagined alien claws at their heels. Once back inside the colony, the weight of their actions settled over them like a heavy cloak. They'd done it, pulled off something incredibly stupid, yet audacious enough to make a difference. Maybe. The mess hall was their unofficial war room, and they gathered there, slumping into chairs with the exhaustion of 1,000 sleepless nights. Celine poured herself a drink, something vaguely resembling coffee, while Jax leaned against the wall, looking like he might actually sleep for a century. So what now? Frank asked, his usual jittery energy subdued. Now we wait, Celine said, sipping the bitter brew. And pray our little cocktail does the trick. And if it doesn't, Liam asked, sounding far too much like the voice of doom. Then we improvise, Jax replied, his tone grim but unwavering. We're good at that, right? Sure, Celine said, though her confidence was as thin as the Martian air. It's practically our job description. The hours ticked by, each one stretching the thin line between hope and despair. They watched the monitors, waiting for any sign that their gambit had worked, that they'd bought themselves a little more time. Finally, the console beeped, drawing everyone's attention like moths to a flame. The screen flickered, and Jax leaned over, reading the data with a growing frown. Well, Celine asked, the question hanging in the air like a sword. Looks like we did something, Jax said slowly, a hint of disbelief in his voice. The Zalter's movements have changed. They're retreating. A collective exhale filled the room, a release of tension so palpable Celine half expected the walls to crack. We did it, Frank breathed, a grin spreading across his face. We actually did it. Don't get too comfortable, Celine warned, though her relief was unmistakable. They might just be regrouping or plotting something worse. Sure, but we'll deal with that tomorrow, Jack said, a rare smile breaking through his gruff exterior. Tonight we celebrate. Celebrate what exactly? Liam asked, though he didn't sound opposed to the idea. Not being dead, Celine replied, raising her mug in a mock toast. To life and all its lovely complications. The room erupted in laughter, loud, genuine, a sound almost forgotten amidst the constant dread. It was a moment of respite, a reminder that even in the darkest times there could be light. As the laughter faded, Celine leaned back, a contented sigh escaping her lips. They'd bought themselves time, uncertain though it was, but for now it was enough. They'd face whatever came next together, one ridiculous, madcap plan at a time. And if the Zalter decided to return, well, Celine was pretty sure they still had a few surprises left up their sleeves. The Martian sunrise painted the sky with its familiar, crusty orange hue, a shade that had come to symbolize both hope and impending doom for the colony. Celine Arcturus found herself squinting against the glare as she stood at the edge of the half-collapsed tunnel, wondering if this was the worst idea she'd ever been a part of. Probably not, but it was definitely in the top 5. Ready to play hero, Liam drawled, adjusting his grip on the makeshift weapon that looked more like a glorified plumbing tool than anything else. He might as well have been asking if she wanted to jump into a Martian crater for kicks. Ready as I'll ever be, she replied, trying to muster enthusiasm. Her confidence was paper-thin, like the atmosphere outside. Besides, who doesn't want their obituary to read died attempting intergalactic stand-up comedy? Captain Jax Riven grunted in agreement, his demeanor resembling a bear who'd woken from hibernation only to find its cave infested with mosquitoes. Let's hope the Zalter have a sense of humor, or at least a gag reflex, he said, his voice carrying the weight of 100 sleepless nights. Frank, their designated klutz, was already halfway down the tunnel, his clumsy strides echoing like a countdown to disaster. I've got a good feeling about this, he called back, radiating a misplaced optimism that made Celine want to strangle him with his own enthusiasm. Good feeling my ass, Liam muttered, following him. The only good feeling I get is when this is someone else's problem. But it wasn't someone else's problem. It was theirs, and they'd have to make the most of it. As they neared the alien perimeter, the air buzzed with a tension that seemed to seep into their bones. The Zalter's food processing unit loomed ahead like some nightmarish blob of organic matter, pulsing with an unsettling glow that reminded Celine of the world's worst nightclub. Remember, Jack said, his voice a low growl, we're here to deliver a cosmic joke, not to become the punchline. Yes, thanks for that, Celine replied, trying to keep her nerves from unraveling. I'll just keep reminding myself that martyrdom is really overrated. Frank was already at the console, fiddling with alien tech in a way that suggested he was either a genius or a madman. Probably both, she thought. He hummed some obnoxious tune as he worked, his fingers moving over the controls with a kind of manic energy. Almost there, he muttered, flipping a final switch with a flourish. Let's see if the Zalter like a little human culture. Celine moved to the console, entering the final commands that would introduce their biochemical cocktail into the Zalter food supply. It was a curious mix of laughter-inducing compounds and audio loops of human laughter, an odd choice, but desperation had led to stranger things. All set, she said, stepping back. Her heart was pounding like an overworked piston, and she half expected the machinery to explode in her face. Now we just pray they find it as funny as we do, or at least unpalatable, Liam added, casting a wary eye over the alien contraption. If it doesn't work, I'm blaming Frank. Join the club, Frank said with a grin that suggested he couldn't care less. I doubt they'll appreciate my taste in humor. The minutes ticked by with agonizing slowness, each second stretching the thin membrane of tension to its breaking point. For a moment, Celine thought she could hear the distant, discordant sounds of Zalter distress, a hopeful sign, if it meant they were actually reacting to their meddling. Then, as if the universe had decided to throw them a bone, the console lit up with a barrage of alerts. The Zalter were in disarray, their movements chaotic and seemingly aimless. It worked, Jax breathed, eyes wide with disbelief. It's actually working. Frank punched the air in triumph. See, I told you. Humor conquers all, even alien taste buds. Don't get cocky, Celine warned, though relief was coursing through her veins like a drug. We've just annoyed them. Let's not stick around to see how long it takes them to get angry. Agreed, Jax said, already retreating toward their exit. We need to get back before they decide they've had enough comedy for one day. They moved with a speed born of pure adrenaline, ducking and weaving through the shadows like thieves in the night. The tunnel seemed to close in around them, the walls threatening to squeeze the air from their lungs, but they pressed on, driven by the singular hope of getting out alive. Back in the colony, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Word had spread like wildfire, and the mess hall was filled with colonists who looked as if they'd been given a sliver of hope in an otherwise hopeless world. Celine felt a swell of pride at what they'd achieved, however temporary it might be. "So, what's next?" Frank asked, his usual jittery energy now amplified by victory. "Next, we see if they want to talk," Jax replied, his tone a mix of relief and caution. "If they are retreating, it means they're considering their options. And if that option is to wipe us out," Liam asked, ever the pessimist, "then we remind them why we're not worth the trouble," Celine said, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "After all, who wants to deal with humans? We're unpredictable, slightly insane, and apparently we taste bad." A ripple of laughter spread through the room, a sound that had been absent for far too long. It was a balm to their frayed nerves, a reminder that amidst the chaos, there was still something worth fighting for. As they settled into the uneasy calm that followed, Celine couldn't help but reflect on the absurdity of it all. Here they were on a planet that wanted them dead, facing an alien race that probably saw them as lunch, and yet they'd managed to pull off the impossible. "To not being lunch," she said, raising her mug in a toast that was half serious, half humorous. "To life and its lovely complications," Jax echoed, clinking his mug against hers. And for a moment, in the dimly lit hall of the Martian colony, there was laughter, there was hope, and there was an understanding that whatever came next, they'd face it together. The ires passed, each one a welcome reprieve from the constant tension that had gripped them for so long. They watched the monitors with bated breath, waiting to see if the Zalter would make contact, if they would finally agree to negotiate. It wasn't long before the console's shrill beep announced an incoming transmission, drawing everyone's attention like bears to honey. The room fell silent as Jax leaned over the console, his expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. "Looks like they're ready to talk," he said, a hint of surprise in his voice. "Let's hope they're in a listening mood," Celine replied, though her heart was pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement. "What do they want?" Jax tapped a few commands, and the console screen flickered to life, displaying a series of alien symbols that seemed to vibrate with tension. "They're asking for a truce, it seems. They want to discuss terms." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room, the weight of their shared anxiety lifting like a mist. Celine felt a knot of tension unravel in her chest, leaving her feeling oddly lightheaded. "We did it," Frank whispered, his voice filled with wonder. "We actually did it. Don't get too comfortable," Jax warned, though his tone was gentler than before. "This is just the beginning." "Great," Liam muttered, though his usual sarcasm was tempered by something akin to hope. "Because I was starting to get bored with the whole imminent death thing." With a newfound sense of purpose, they prepared for the negotiations, determined to make the most of this unexpected opportunity. Celine found herself grinning at the absurdity of it all, humans, using laughter and insanity to turn the tide against an alien threat. As they gathered around the console, ready to face the unknown, Celine felt a surge of optimism she hadn't experienced in a long time. They'd pulled off the impossible, and now they had a chance to make it count. "Okay," Jax said, his voice steady and calm as he prepared to open the channel. "Let's show them what humans are made of." "Chaos and caffeine," Frank suggested, his grin infectious. "More like stubbornness and a refusal to die quietly," Celine replied, her eyes glinting with determination. And with that, they stepped into the unknown once more, ready to negotiate with the very beings they'd just outwitted. It was a crazy, dangerous gamble, just the kind they specialized in. But if there was one thing Celine knew, it was that humans were nothing if not resourceful. The channel opened and the conversation began, each word carrying the weight of their hopes and fears. Whatever the outcome, they'd face it together, one mad, improbable plan at a time. And if the Zalter decided to test them again, well, Celine was pretty sure they had more than a few surprises left up their sleeves. The Martian colony, that rusted toaster on a dusty rock, was finally bustling with something resembling optimism. People were scurrying around with a purpose, patching up corridors, fixing hydroponic systems, and generally trying to unfuck the place. For the first time in what felt like forever, Celine didn't feel like they were all on a sinking ship in space, or in this case, a sinking toaster. In the mess hall, someone had put up a sign: "We survived alien cuisine humans, 1 Zalter 0. Beneath it, someone else had scrawled, "For now," in a pessimistic flourish. Celine couldn't help but chuckle as she passed it. Humor, dark and twisted as it might be, was the one thing they had in abundance. Celine strolled into the lab, which looked like a tornado had nested inside. Beakers and vials lay strewn about in a chaos that only she could navigate. Her latest experiment, a burbling concoction that had saved their asses, was still fizzing ominously in the corner. The lab was a testament to human ingenuity, or possibly a reason to tighten safety regulations. Jax entered, his face set in a permanent scowl that hadn't quite figured out how to be anything else. Celine, he grunted. Got a minute? Sure, she replied, pretending to clean up the lab by shuffling papers from one pile to another. What's up, or down? Or sideways, given our luck. Jax leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. Just came from the council meeting. They want to know if we can trust the Zalter not to roast us for dinner. Celine laughed. I'm guessing trust isn't exactly their first instinct either, but they're keeping their word for now. Probably trying to figure out why we taste like bad jokes. They've got plenty to chew on, Jax said dryly. I just hope they stick to taste testing and not full-on feasting, Celine shrugged. Humans aren't exactly Michelin star material. Maybe we're safe by virtue of being unappetizing. Jax snorted. I'll drink to that. He paused, the lines on his face deepening with thought. But seriously, Celine. Do you think we can make this work? I think, she replied, measuring her words, that for the first time in a long time we've got a chance. And that's more than we had yesterday. Jax nodded, a rare look of satisfaction crossing his features. Well, if humor and biochem cocktails can stop an alien invasion, maybe anything's possible. Or maybe we're just the universe's favorite sitcom, Celine said. Glad to have you as part of the cast. Their conversation was cut short by Frank's arrival, who burst in with his typical whirlwind enthusiasm. Guys, he yelled, nearly knocking over a precarious stack of lab equipment. The Zalter are sending over some kind of message. They want to do a cultural exchange. Celine raised an eyebrow. Let me guess they're inviting us over for dinner, more like a mixer, Frank said, trying to catch his breath. They want to share knowledge, culture, you know. Not recipes, I hope. Great, Jax muttered, rubbing his temples as if trying to massage away a headache. First they try to eat us, now they want to exchange Christmas cards. Celine pondered for a moment. Well, it's a start. I mean, who knows what we might learn? Maybe their secret to happiness is a good marinade, or we just end up teaching them how to cook humans properly, Jax replied with a smirk. Look on the bright side, Frank chimed in. At least they're not shooting at us, that's true, Celine admitted. All right, let's see what cultural delights the Zalter have in store. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. The colony was being spruced up, or at least as much as you could spruce up a place that looked like the aftermath of a junkyard explosion. Celine found herself reluctantly acting as one of the negotiators, a job she was about as qualified for as Frank was at ballet dancing. The first exchange took place in a makeshift conference room, which was really just the mess hall with some hastily arranged furniture and a few half-dead plants for ambience. The Zalter emissary arrived, a spindly creature with skin like a mesh of circuits and eyes that glowed faintly with an unsettling light. Welcome, Celine said, trying to sound diplomatic. Hope you had a pleasant journey. The Zalter made a series of sounds that the translator interpreted as, your hospitality is adequate, a ringing endorsement if ever there was one. Captain Jax, ever the charmer, leaned forward. So what does a cultural exchange look like in your neck of the galaxy? Our people wish to understand your humor, the Zalter replied. It is an anomaly to us. Potential resource. Well, Jax said, you've come to the right place. We're nothing if not a joke. The Zalter's gaze was inscrutable, but the translator conveyed a sense of curiosity. Please display this humor. Celine considered their options. Frank, you're up, she said with a wicked grin. Frank looked like a deer caught in headlights. Me. Why me? Because your existence is a joke, Jax said with a deadpan expression. Go on, show them. Frank cleared his throat awkwardly. Okay, why did the human cross the road? He paused for effect. Because we've got nowhere else to go on this godforsaken rock. There was a silence in the room, the kind that typically followed awkward dinners and bad speeches. The Zalter emitted a noise that could have been laughter or maybe indigestion. Your jest is strange, the translator said, but intriguing. We will consider more exchanges. Glad you enjoyed the show, Celine said. Stick around, we're here all week. The meeting ended with a promise of future collaborations, and as the Zalter departed, Celine felt a surprising sense of accomplishment. Maybe there was hope after all, even if it came in the form of awful jokes and awkward interspecies interactions. As the days turned into weeks, the colony slowly began to rebuild. The Martian sky, ever that crusty orange, remained a constant reminder of their precarious existence, yet now it seemed less oppressive. The colonists were working together, fixing infrastructure, bolstering defenses, and even planting new crops in the hydroponics bay. Celine found herself spending more time in the lab, working on projects that might help the colony thrive rather than just survive. She still had a knack for avoiding work, but now it was because she was genuinely passionate, not just lazy. One evening, Jax joined her in the lab, carrying 2 mugs of something that might loosely be called coffee. Thought you could use a break, he said, handing her a mug. Thanks, Celine replied, taking a sip of the bitter liquid. I'd forgotten what this tasted like. Almost better when you've forgotten, Jax chuckled. "So how's it going? We're making progress," Celine said, gesturing to the equipment scattered around her. "The new fungal concoction should increase our food output by about 20% if we don't accidentally blow ourselves up first." "Good," Jax replied, his voice thoughtful. "We've come a long way, haven't we? From being alien chow trying to forge some kind of peace." "Yeah," Celine agreed. "I guess we're stubborn that way. Refused to die quietly, remember, never doubted it," Jax said, clinking his mug against hers. "Here's to not being lunch." They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the orange twilight fade into Martian night. The colony was still filled with challenges, still dancing on the knife's edge of survival, but there was a stubborn resilience that seemed to define them. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. "Think we'll ever get back to Earth?" Celine asked, breaking the silence. Jack shrugged. "Who knows, but as long as we're here, we might as well make the most of it. Besides, I hear Earth's overrated." Celine laughed. "Yeah, who needs blue skies and green grass when you've got this lovely view?" "Exactly," Jack said with a grin. "Besides, out here we're part of something bigger. Something we're building ourselves." For once, Celine couldn't argue. The colony, with its mismatched parts and underdog spirit, was home. Flawed, struggling, and full of misfits, but home nonetheless. As they watched the stars come out, pinpricks of light in the vast, indifferent cosmos, Celine realized that maybe, just maybe, they'd found their place after all. And if the Zalter came knocking again, well, they'd be ready with a joke and a plan, just like always. In the end, life on Mars was a mixed whiskey of chaos and camaraderie, with a dash of existential dread. But it was theirs, and that was more than enough.